Okay, thank you very much for coming. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. I want to introduce Chet van Duzer. Chet van Duzer is a remarkable independent scholar. He has published extensively on medieval and Renaissance maps. He's the co-author of Seeing the World Anew, the radical vision of Martin Waldseemüller. His book, Sea Monsters, on medieval and Renaissance map was published in 2013 by the British Library. And the same library just published the book, The War for a King. The Library of Congress published in 2014 his study of Christopher Columbus' Book of Privileges. And he's the board member of the Lazarus Project at the University of Mississippi, which provide low-cost access, should I say access?
Yeah.
To multispectral imaging and to institutions and researchers around the world. And he is the first guest of this series, The Ocean and Its Metaphor. And thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm proud to initiate this series on the ocean, which I think is a wonderful idea and a wonderful topic. I'll be talking today about changes in European ideas about the ocean, the oceans, including the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and Pacific. And I'll be telling that story mostly by way of maps. So I'll start out with this quotation. The circle of reality has always been contained in a larger one whose limits mark the beginning of the imaginary. And that's by Fernando Ainza. And I'm going to go from that text to this image. So this is a medieval mappa mundi. This one's from the 15th century, but maps very similar to this were made for some centuries before the 15th century. And what we see here is called a TO map. And it's called that from the O of the circumfluent ocean and the T of the bodies of water that divide the continents from each other. So Asia, Europe, and Africa. The Tanais, well, I'll show you here. The Tanais or Don River divides Asia from Europe, the Nile, Asia from Africa, and the Mediterranean, Europe from Africa. So what we have here is the known lands of the world surrounded by the ocean. And so the ocean is precisely the realm of the imaginary, the realm of the mythical. And this type of mappa mundi conveys that very clearly. We can see this map would not be useful for getting anywhere. It's not a map to be used in travel. And I just want to mention briefly that there are more elaborate examples of this type of map. So this one has just 3 place names, no topographical detail whatsoever, no mountains, no rivers. There are more elaborate examples that have that same schematic TO structure. Anyway, my point here is that the Atlantic, the circumfluent ocean, the oceans in general, were a place of myth. They were beyond the known. So we'll start by looking at some quotations about the ocean in classical antiquity. So the ocean was a place of danger, and it was so in fact, but the fact that it was a place of danger combined with the fact it was largely unknown turned it into this realm of dangerous, sort of mythological danger, shall we say. So Seneca the Elder in the 1st century says, "The ocean cannot be sailed. There, motionless, stands the sea, an inert mass of nature, failing, as it were, at its own limits. Strange and frightening shapes, monsters great even for the ocean, nurtured by that desolate depth, light plunged in the deepest gloom, day cut off by darkness, the sea itself heavy and stationary, stars either vanished or unfamiliar." So to say that the ocean is dangerous is one thing, but to say that its nature failing, as it were, at its own limits. This is a very extreme conception of the ocean. You cannot be sailed. So nature is sort of collapsing in this unknown, dangerous region. And I've written about sea monsters. I'm going to show some pictures of sea monsters. Here's some Roman images of sea monsters. And I want to point out that these few images I'm showing here are based on a classical and medieval theory which held that for every land creature there was a corresponding creature in the sea. So it was a very fertile generator of sea monsters. So here we have an aquatic lion, not a sea lion as we know them, but an aquatic lion, a lion with a fishy tail. An aquatic goat. And even an aquatic eagle. So a flying creature that also lives in the sea. So just again to point out a few of Roman artistic images of some of these dangerous creatures in the sea. Moving on to another quote from Albino Vanos Pedo. He's describing the difficulties of a Roman fleet in the Atlantic in the 1st century. Banished from the familiar limits of the world, they dare to pass through forbidden shades to the bounds of things, the remotest shores of the world. Now they think ocean, that breeds beneath its sluggish waves terrible monsters, savage sea beasts everywhere, and dogs of the sea, is rising, taking the ships with it. The very noise increases their fears. Now they think the vessels are sinking in the mud, the fleet deserted by the swift wind, themselves left by indolent fate to the sea beasts to be torn apart unhappily. So again, a very, to us at least, exaggerated picture of the dangers of the ocean, particularly in the beginning there, through forbidden shades to the bounds of things. The limits of reality are out in the ocean. So it's this tremendously, powerfully unknown and dangerous region. And just to illustrate that with an image, we have some ships foundering in a storm. And moving now to the 6th century, we have the 4th century, we have a quote from St. Ambrose. Who knows, after all, how far this great sea extends, on to which sailors do not dare to sail, and up till now have not attempted to do so, and which surrounds Britain with furious waves, and which reaches even further places that are not even accessible in legends. Not accessible in legends. It's hard to know even exactly what that means. It's not just a mythical realm, it's beyond myth, is what he's saying. So the ocean was this place of mythical danger. So moving into the Middle Ages, I'm going to start with the painted ceiling of the Church of St. Martin in Zillis, Switzerland, which consists of 154 painted wooden panels that depict the life of Christ and the life of St. Martin. That depicts the lives of Christ and St. Martin doesn't sound like it would be a map, but the ceiling actually has some significant map-like features. And what I would suggest is that it's not a map to show us how to get from one place on the world, but it's an image of the world as a stage for the playing out of Christian history. And a couple of those map features, first in each of the 4 corners we have an angel with trumpets. And this alludes of course to Revelation 7:1-2 about the 4 angels blowing trumpets in the 4 corners of the world. So this image alone indicates that we're talking about an image of the world. Moreover, the panels that go along the edges of the ceiling all have water in them. So we have this circumfluent ocean that we saw in medieval Mappa Mundi. Moreover, that circumfluent ocean is densely populated with dangerous monsters. So if we zoom in on a few of them, we have a sea stag, perhaps biting a seahorse. A sea stag being bitten by a seahorse. We have a sea lion eating an aquatic chicken. And again, these creatures are clearly based on that theory that for each creature on land, there's a corresponding creature in the oceans. We have here a dog-headed aquatic man. So the head of a dog, the torso of a human, and a fishy tail, with its human victim on a skewer. So the outer ocean is depicted as a very dangerous place indeed. And then we have what looks to us like an aquatic elephant, but was probably intended to represent a walrus. And I think what happened here is that there was a text saying that the walrus has tusks like an elephant, and the artist didn't know how to depict a walrus, so he did the best he could. So again, the ceiling of the Church of St. Martin's in Zillis depicts the outer ocean as a place of monstrous inhabitants and great danger. So now I want to talk about ideas that navigation in the ocean was limited in various ways in both the West and the South. So we've seen that it was a dangerous place, but there were more specific limits, idea that you couldn't navigate to both either the West or the South out in the ocean. And the first is the idea of the Pillars of Hercules in the West. So one of the many stories about Hercules was that in his travels, when he reached the westernmost point of his travels, he established these pillars to mark that spot. And those pillars were in the Strait of Gibraltar. And there's, in fact, two mountains that sit across each other at the Strait of Gibraltar, which are known as the Pillars of Hercules. And they are depicted on maps. Here's the Strait of Gibraltar. This is a map in a manuscript of Ptolemy's geography. If we zoom in a little bit, we see that the artist has actually depicted the mountains as pillars. So these are the Pillars of Hercules in the Strait of Gibraltar. And if Hercules could go no further than his pillars, what chance would the rest of us have of going any further? So these pillars were held to represent the limits of human travel to the west from the Mediterranean. If we move forward in time a little bit, this is the Anglo-Saxon or Cotton map in the British Library from the 10th or 11th century. And it takes a moment to orient oneself, but here I've indicated the British Isles, Europe, and Africa. So in between we have the Strait of Gibraltar. And zooming in a little bit, have the Pillars of Hercules depicted at the very western edge of the map. So at the western limit of geographical knowledge. What's also very interesting here is that they are no longer exactly in the Strait of Gibraltar. They've migrated out a little bit as if to indicate that, well, it's possible to go a little distance outside the Strait of Gibraltar. In Islamic geographers, the idea arose that it wasn't simply a pillar of Hercules, but a pillar with a statue of Hercules holding a key. And I've never quite understood this part, but somehow the key itself was supposed to indicate that travel further to the west was not possible. And this idea made its way from Islamic sources into European sources, into European books, by way of a commentary on Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. And here we have an image of that in the Historia de España, which was written in, I think, about 1370. And we see the statue holding this key, indicating that travel further to the west, including, of course, sailing voyages further to the west, were impossible. Moving on to a nautical chart. So a nautical chart is something very different than the Mappae Mundi I showed at the beginning of this talk. A nautical chart was a map that was intended to aid travel from one point to another. It was intended to guide sailors as they sailed. And this chart of 1367 was made by the Pizzigani brothers in Italy. And I've just indicated, it takes a moment to orient oneself on these maps, but I've indicated Ireland and the Strait of Gibraltar. And we can see we have Hercules, in this case, well out from the Strait of Gibraltar. So this idea of this western limit to navigation has migrated out into the Atlantic a little bit. Zooming in a little bit, and it's a hard image to understand, but what we have is Hercules upside down and with this banner. And then we have a text beside him that says, here is the statue that was in the time of Hercules, who founded Zirquo, we don't know what that is exactly, for the safety of mariners. It was built at the edge of the sea, that one can navigate, but beyond the statue is a shallow sea that cannot support ships. So in this case, it's not just we have this idea that the sea beyond Hercules is unnavigably shallow. So there's multiple ways in which people in medieval Europe thought that navigation was limited in the Atlantic. You just can't go out very far. Moving to another map, this is a geographically elaborate mappa mundi made in 1448 by Andreas Walsberger in Germany. And I've indicated the Strait of Gibraltar in Africa. You can see a red splotch in the middle, that's the Red Sea. And often a good way to orient oneself on a medieval or Renaissance map is to find that splotch of red, and then you know where the Red Sea is. Zooming in a little bit, we have the Strait of Gibraltar and an island with 5 pillars. Again, a little distance out to the west from the Strait of Gibraltar, acknowledging that navigation was possible outside the strait, which is an interesting transformation. And zooming in, the text says, here are the columns of Hercules because of the dangers that must be avoided. So while this idea of this western limit to travel had moved out into the Atlantic, it hadn't moved very far. I now want to mention a limit to western navigation that did not exist, which was the edge of the flat Earth. There's this idea that people in medieval times thought that if you sailed too far west, you would fall off the edge of the Earth. Let's see, it's illustrated various places. This is totally and completely false. And it's a myth that's almost uneradicable. It's unextirpable. It was the idea had its origin in Washington Irving's biography of Christopher Columbus. And Irving, writing a biography of Columbus, wanted to portray Columbus as the great hero, the great wise man who knew more than his contemporaries. And one way to do that was to portray Columbus's contemporaries as having this idea that, well, if you sail too far west, you will fall off the edge of the Earth. It is very easy to find documents that prove that educated people from Antiquity through the Middle Ages knew that the Earth was spherical. We have a manuscript image here from 1320 showing people on the different sides of the spherical Earth. And we have here a beautiful image made in 1485 of Strabo, the Greek geographer, not just with a globe, but pointing to the globe. I think that's a nice touch. One can read all about the history of this myth, its origins, and its continuation in the book by Geoffrey Russell, Inventing the Flat Earth. So that's one limit to navigation that did not exist, but there are plenty of others. And I want to mention a limit to navigation in the south. So we've looked at some limits to navigation to the west. There were also limits to the south. This idea of the torrid zone, and I'll begin with a quote from Pliny the Elder, the Roman encyclopedist. The middle of the earth, over which is the orbit of the sun, is parched and burned by the flame, and is consumed by being so near the heat. There are only 2 of the zones which are temperate, those which lie between the torrid and frigid zones, and these are separated from each other in consequence of the scorching heat of the heavenly bodies. So the equator, the equatorial zone is indeed hot, but what Pliny says is it's burned by the flame and impassable and uninhabitable. And this idea was represented on maps, which are called zonal mappa mundi or climatic mappa mundi. So we have the torrid zone at the equator. We have temperate zones, habitable zones to the north and south of that, and then uninhabitably frigid zones towards the poles. So again, it is in fact cold at the poles, it is in fact hot at the equator, but this is an exaggerated idea of that. And in this particular mappa mundi, the torrid zone is helpfully indicated in red. That's not always the case, but here's one more example where the torrid zone is red. So it was uninhabitable. It was also impassable. you could not sail, you could not survive sailing from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere because the equatorial zone was burned by flames, uninhabitable and unpassable. So if one was contemplating long sea voyages, the torrid zone would certainly discourage, that this idea of the torrid zone would certainly discourage a voyage to the south. So over time, ideas about the ocean began to change. We've seen the Pillars of Hercules migrate out into the Atlantic a little bit, and there were also some explorations out into the Atlantic. And I want to look at a few of those to sort of trace this change in ideas about the Atlantic over time. So returning to the Pizzigani nautical chart of 1367, where we saw Hercules before, I want to now zoom in on the Iberian Peninsula, specifically these three ships. So what we have are three ships, and their flags indicate that they are from Majorca, Venice, and Genoa, sailing from the Mediterranean. We can see the direction of sail, north, perhaps towards Flanders, perhaps to trade in Flanders. But what's important here is they're clearly depicted sailing out of the Mediterranean and up into the Atlantic. At the same time, on this same map, let's zoom back out for a moment and now zoom in on another part that's a little further out in the Atlantic, not much. We have this scene. We have two ships. A flying dragon is carrying away a sailor from one, and a giant octopus is pulling a sailor from another. And the texts say that one of these ships was actually left without sailors. So this is just a little further out in the Atlantic from where we saw three ships sailing from the Mediterranean north, perhaps towards Flanders. A little bit further out in the Atlantic, we have this scene of tremendous danger to navigation. So even while this map shows visually that navigation out into the Atlantic is possible, it clearly also indicates, not just with this scene, but also with the image of Hercules, that if you go a little too far, you're still in danger. Again, looking at another exploration in the Atlantic, the rediscovery of the Canary Islands. So the Canary Islands were known in classical antiquity, and on the basis of classical texts are depicted on a number of medieval mappamundi. This is the famous Hereford mappamundi made in about 1300. This is a digitally restored version of the map, and what the creators have done, they've looked at the pigments and extrapolated back from the currently faded colors to the colors they think with good reason the map showed originally. So here the oceans and seas are a fairly bright green. That's a restored color. If you look at the map as it currently appears today, the colors of the oceans are substantially, shall we say, dingier. But again, just to orient ourselves a little bit, we have the Mediterranean in the middle, Africa to the south, Europe to the north. The map nominally is oriented with east at the top, but I've rotated it so that things are a little bit more familiar. And the map includes the Canary Islands in the circumfluent ocean, and again, based on texts in classical texts. But if we move forward a little bit to a nautical chart by Angelino dell'Orto, made in 1339, and again, takes a moment to orient oneself, but we can see the Red Sea is helpfully painted in red. That green, this green thing going across northern Africa is the Atlas mountain chains. Some historians of cartography have referred to that as the Atlas mountain chain as a palm tree. It's not intended to represent a palm tree, but it looks a little bit like one. And we have on this chart the Canary Islands. And if we zoom in, we can see they're marked with the Genoese flag, indicating a recent Genoese visit to the islands. And they're called the Insula de Lanzarote Marocellus, an Italian navigator. So the Canary Islands were known in classical antiquity and were rediscovered to Europe in the early 14th century. An early voyage down the coast of Africa This is the western portion of the Catalan Atlas of 1375, which is one of the most elaborately decorated nautical charts to survive. And in fact, it takes nautical chart data and expands it substantially to the east, all the way to the eastern coast of Asia by including information not from mariners but from Marco Polo. Our concern here is with the western part of the map. Again, just to orient ourselves a little bit, the British Isles, Iberian Peninsula, and Africa. And then at the southern edge of the map, we have a ship. So out in the Atlantic. And zooming in, the text to the right indicates that this is the ship of Jacques Ferrer, who, the text explains, in the 1340s, so some years before the creation of the map, sailed down the coast of Africa looking for the River of Gold. And in fact, you can see that just in front of the ship, there's a little golden island there. And it was thought that a lot of the gold that came from Africa came from this River of Gold. And Jacques Ferrer went searching for it. He was never heard from again, neither he nor his men. And so that's a very clear indication that, on the one hand, people were willing to brave the dangers of the Atlantic if they thought they had a good reason, but it was still a very dangerous place. Another Atlantic exploration is the discovery of the Azores. And just to indicate where the Azores are here, they're west of the Iberian Peninsula. Switching now to a nautical chart. This is the chart by Gabriel de Valseca, made in 1439. And again, the Red Sea is helpfully in red. We have the Atlas Mountain chain in North Africa depicted very similarly. And zooming in, we have the Azores. And then zooming in a little bit further, we have this text that says, "These islands were discovered by Diego de Silves, pilot of the King of Portugal, in the year 1427. And interestingly, this chart is the only record we have of that voyage, which is an interesting case showing that maps are a very important historical resource, and they sometimes contain information that does not survive in other forms. My main point here, though, is that in the 14th and 15th century, voyages out into the Atlantic were being undertaken. And so this idea that it was impossible to sail in the Atlantic was beginning to fall by the wayside, but it was a long process. So another step in the change of ideas about the Atlantic is the debunking of the torrid zone. So we saw this map before and talked about this idea that there was this torrid zone at the equator, not just hot, but impassably and uninhabitably hot. Well, if we look at, this is a book owned by Christopher Columbus, his own copy with annotations in his own hand. And this is Pierre Dailly's Imago Mundi, or Image of the World, so a cosmographical text. And it was one of the most important works that Columbus studied that helped inform his ideas about the world. And I want to look particularly at this annotation, which we can see Columbus has made a double border around, so he considered it to be quite important. And he writes, "The torrid zone is not uninhabitable, since the Portuguese sail through it, but on the contrary, it is very inhabited." So it's not just passable, but it's also inhabited. So we're seeing there the overturning of this ancient and medieval idea that there was this torrid zone that absolutely prevented sailing from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, or sailing very far to the south from Europe at all. And another sign of the fading of this idea about the torrid zone, and this one quite dramatic. This is José de Acosta in his Natural and Moral History of the Indies. He says, "Having read what poets and philosophers write of the torrid zone, I persuaded myself that when I came to the equator, I would not be able to endure the violent heat, but it turned out otherwise. What could I do then but laugh at Aristotle's meteorology and his philosophy?" So, laughing at this idea that there is a torrid zone, that the idea is dead. moving on to the downfall of another idea about a limit to navigation in the Atlantic. The idea that the Pillars of Hercules represented an insurmountable barrier began to go by the wayside. Here we have Martin Beheim's terrestrial globe of 1492, which is the earliest surviving terrestrial globe. Globes were made earlier, they just have not survived. And I want to look at this text on the globe, which is in the Southern Ocean. The far-off places toward midnight or tramontana, beyond Ptolemy's description, such as Iceland, Norway, and Russia, are likewise now known to us and are visited annually by ships. Wherefore let none doubt the simple arrangement of the world, and that every part may be reached in ships, as is here to be seen, meaning on his globe. Every part of the world may be reached in ships. What a dramatic statement in contrast to the things we've just seen, this idea of the torrid zone and the Pillars of Hercules. Every part may be reached by ships. And looking more concretely at this idea of the Pillars of Hercules, here we have the coat of arms of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. I chose a representation of them from the Cathedral of Seville. Beside the coat of arms proper, there's a representation of the Pillars of Hercules, and on the pillars there are banners that read plus ultra, further beyond. So again, the idea that the Pillars of Hercules represented a barrier to navigation has fallen very dramatically. Here the idea is, well, let's go beyond them. And just to look at one other representation of that same image. So here we have tiles with symbols of Spain, Castile and Leon, Castle and the Lion, with the Pillars of Hercules and the motto plus ultra. So the idea that the pillars represented a barrier to navigation has fallen by the wayside. So I've spoken quite a bit about the Atlantic. What about the other oceans? The Indian Ocean. So I want to look at a Ptolemaic world map. This is from a 15th century manuscript. And again, it requires a moment to orient oneself seeing a map like this. So here we have the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, Africa. This is Taprobana, usually identified with Sri Lanka. So this is the Indian Ocean. And I want to zoom in on the eastern part of the Indian Ocean and see what was Ptolemy's conception of the Indian Ocean. I've switched now from Ptolemy's world map to Ptolemy's map of the eastern Indian Ocean. And we can see there are a number of islands there. Ptolemy says that this group of islands is inhabited by satyrs, so men with tails, basically. This group of islands is inhabited by cannibals. This group of island is inhabited by cannibals. And these is a group of magnetic islands that destroy ships. So any ship with nails that sails by these islands, the magnets pull the nails out, and you get a scene like this, where the artist has helpfully indicated the nails, which I've circled in red at the top, flying out of the ship. So the Indian Ocean as well was depicted as a place of great danger. Cannibals, satyrs, magnetic islands. And the Indian Ocean was the ocean furthest from Europe, and as a result, it was the great unknown, so it's natural that it would be portrayed as this place of danger. So looking now at the so-called Genoese map of 1457, there's not really any good reason to think that it's Genoese, but that's what people call it. And again, we'll take a moment to orient ourselves. Europe, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. And again, we have the Red Sea helpfully indicated in red there. But zooming in on the Indian Ocean, we can see that it is abundantly populated with sea monsters. I'll zoom in on each of them in a moment, but a significant portion of the area of the Indian Ocean is occupied by sea monsters. So going from west to east, we have this sea pig, an aquatic pig. So again, one of the hybrid creatures based on this theory that for every land creature there's a corresponding sea creature. The siren. On a lot of early Renaissance maps, if there is a siren depicted, it's in the Indian Ocean. And the argument could be made that that was because there was plenty of open space in the Indian Ocean, but I think it's also because the Indian Ocean was furthest from Europe, and thus a suitable grounds, if you were, for mythological creatures. And then we have the Serra, so named from its serrated crest, with which it was held to saw into the undersides of ships. And there's a little text below the creature that explains that the Serra sometimes gets its saw stuck in the bottoms of ships and can't free itself and then commits suicide. And then we have this imposing demon-like creature in the eastern Indian Ocean. And the text says that it was captured and exhibited in Ferrara in Italy. The sea pig isn't very scary. That's a little intimidating. So the Indian Ocean, as the Atlantic was, as we saw, it was a place of danger. This is the Catalan Estense world map of about 1460. Catalan because it was made in Catalonia, Estense because it's preserved in the Estense Library. And again, we'll take a moment to orient ourselves. Europe, a very strangely shaped Africa, and the Indian Ocean. And zooming in on the Indian Ocean, we have three different kinds of sirens, which the text identifies as the one at top is half woman, half fish. The one in the middle is half woman, half bird. And the one at the bottom is half woman, half horse. So again, the Indian Ocean was a place of strange beings. Returning to our Ptolemaic world map, I want to point to an interesting feature of it, which is in the Indian Ocean. We can see there that we have a land bridge joining southern Africa with southern Asia. We can see little peninsulas. And there is no such land bridge. Ptolemy was mistaken. He, like a number of early cartographers, he took little data points and extrapolated as best he could from them, and in this case his extrapolation was wrong. He believed that the Indian Ocean was a closed body of water, closed by that land bridge. And again we have this idea that in some way an ocean was limited. And this, due to the great respect that Ptolemy enjoyed in Europe following his rediscovery in the 15th century, this idea is portrayed in some other maps. We have a printed world map from about 1485. Again, a moment to orient ourselves, Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so the Indian Ocean here is shown as enclosed by land. Moving forward in time, not forward in time, back in time a little bit. This is Fra Mauro's world map of about 1455. And as we can see, he depicts the Indian Ocean as open. So some people realized in the 15th century that Ptolemy simply had been mistaken about that idea. But Fra Mauro didn't simply depict the Indian Ocean as open, he addressed the subject. Again, sorry, just a moment to orient ourselves here. In this text in the Indian Ocean, he says, some authors write that the Sea of India is enclosed like a pond and does not communicate with the ocean. However, Solinus claims that it is itself part of the ocean and that it is navigable in the southern and southwestern parts. And I myself say that some ships have sailed along that route. So the idea was still popular enough or prevalent enough that Fra Mauro felt obliged to address it in this text on his map. Here we have a world map based on Ptolemy in the Margarita Philosophica by Georg Reich from 1504. And this map is really quite amazing. We have in the land bridge joining southern Africa with southern Asia. So it's a Ptolemaic map, so we have the land bridge. We have this text that says, here is not land, but sea, in which there are islands of remarkable size unknown to Ptolemy. So the text directly contradicts the image. the cartographer was making a Ptolemaic map, felt obliged to follow Ptolemy graphically, but also felt obliged to indicate this huge mistake that Ptolemy had made. Other cartographers adopted a different solution. This is the world map in a 1513 edition of Ptolemy. So an edition of Ptolemy's geography, meaning that the maps should represent the world according to Ptolemy. But the cartographer, Martin Waldseemler, could not bring himself to represent something he knew to be such a fundamental mistake and simply omits it. I want to now show another world map by the same cartographer, Martin Waldseemler. This is his Carta Marina of 1516. It's a printed world map on 12 sheets. The only surviving exemplar is the Library of Congress. And I want to focus on this image here. So this is at the southern tip of Africa. And if we zoom in, we have an image of King Manuel of Portugal riding a sea monster, thus visually proclaiming Portugal's control of the route around Asia to Africa. To me, this is a really remarkable image. So before we saw that sea monsters indicated danger in the oceans, here we show a sea monster being controlled by a human precisely to indicate human mastery of this sea route from Europe around Africa to Asia. It's a very striking image, particularly given that on a world map made by the same cartographer just 9 years earlier, he has text about dangerous sea monsters. So in the course of 9 years, he changed his ideas about the oceans very dramatically. And continue with the Indian Ocean, we'll have a quick look at a world map by Diego Ribeiro, made in 1529. This image doesn't have a lot of contrast, so I'm going to switch to a facsimile and then focus on this part of it. We can see that we have a whole series of ships sailing from Asia around Africa to Europe, clearly proclaiming the possibility and the practice of making that journey. So the Indian Ocean is no longer a place of danger. It's visually indicated as a place where people can sail, commerce can be conducted. And a few words about the Pacific. So we have here the other world map by Martin Waldseemler, his world map of 1507, which is famous for being the first map to apply the name America to the New World. It's also famous for showing water to the west of the Americas. And this is before the discovery of the Pacific, European discovery of the Pacific by Balboa in 1513. And the fact that it shows water to the west of the New World has generated a lot of speculation about a pre-discovery of the Pacific. I do not think that's the case. What I think happened is that Marco Polo very clearly states that Japan is an island. Amerigo Vespucci is very clear that the New World is not Asia. So if the New World is not Japan and Japan's an island, there has to be water between them. It's just a logical deduction. It's not, I don't think, an indication of a pre-discovery. But in any case, we have the sort of proto-Pacific represented on the 1507 map. And Johann Schoner, in making his globe of 1515, followed Waldseemler very closely. And here it's a little bit more obvious just how narrow that proto-Pacific is. So it's just a few degrees of water between the New World and Japan. And so really the Pacific didn't have time, as it were, to be mythologized before it was properly known and discovered. The whole idea that there might be water there just occurred a few years before Balboa actually discovered it for Europe in 1513. And the change thereafter on maps is very dramatic. Here we have a world map by Juan Vespucci made in 1526. And suddenly the Pacific is this enormous entity. So again, the Pacific didn't have time to be mythologized the way the other oceans did before it was properly known. So a few words about circumnavigation. So this idea that the oceans were closed, at least in terms of our ideas about, European ideas about the oceans, there were all these limits to navigation. Well, there were some people who speculated about the possibility of circumnavigation. And if you can circumnavigate, the oceans are open. So this idea was possible, was entertained. Here we have an image of Nicole Oresme, the French philosopher in the 14th century. He conducted a thought experiment about circumnavigation and realized that one would lose a day going east and gain a day going west, and calculated that a circumnavigation would take 4 years, 16 weeks, and 2 days. Again, this was a thought experiment. He didn't contemplate putting it into action. John Mandeville in the 14th century wrote this fantastic travel account and alludes in a way to a circumnavigation in a frustratingly vague way. He says that a man traveled east from Europe beyond India and eventually heard people speaking his own language. So meaning that he'd gotten back around the world to his own place of origin, but we don't hear anything about what that place was. It's really not very satisfactory. And of course then it's important to come back to that passage on Martin Beckheim's globe of 1492, the idea that every part of the world may be reached in ships as is here to be seen. But really the idea of circumnavigation, well, the practice of navigation awaited Magellan's voyage. And so that proved, some people had entertained the idea that the world was circumnavigable and thus that the oceans were open. But it was Magellan who did that and who clearly demonstrated the great extent of the Pacific. And just a couple words of conclusion. We saw earlier this map by Andreas Walsberger of 1448, which showed these pillars of Hercules just outside of the Strait of Gibraltar, indicating a limit to westward navigation. Well, so that's 1448. In this map, made less than 100 years later, we have the course of Magellan's journey around the world indicated on the map. Moreover, the journey started and ended in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is right near the Strait of Gibraltar. So the Strait of Gibraltar had gone from being this limit to westward navigation to being a portal for the exploration of the world. So it's really an incredibly dramatic shift in the course of 2 or 3 centuries. Thank you very much.